English translation, 611th contact, Tuesday, the 3rd of February 2015, 22:09 hours.
Excuse me for interrupting your phone call when
No need to apologize, dear friend. I did tell Bruni I had to cut short my conversation with her. But be greeted and welcome.
I also greet you, and I would like to come straight to the fact that I have checked the records of the month of January and found that there is an unpleasant matter to be addressed, which I have also discussed with Quetzal and our committee. Consequently, I am speaking on their behalf. I am sure you know what it is about, which is why I cannot discuss the whole thing, but can only say that it must be regulated in the relationship that only one person representing the core group should attend or be involved in national interest or study group meetings, but not two. This should be observed in the future because otherwise unpleasant situations can arise which are not conducive to the mission. Even if two persons represent one and the same cause, they do so as differently as two different mills grind differently.
So, if I understand correctly, in the future, there should no longer be two or more core group members at the meetings of other groups, but only one core group member at a time. What you are referring to, I think, relates to the fact that previously sometimes two core group members were designated to represent the core group.
This is correct, because otherwise unpleasant disparities will inevitably arise. Consequently, the rule must henceforth be observed that only one member of the core group may attend the meetings of other groups, which must henceforth apply and without exceptions even when two persons are closely associated in partnership.
So if two core group members are in close partnership, then they cannot do a core group substitution either. But then what about when two core group members in a partnership are invited by a national interest or study group?
Then this may be accepted, but only one of the two core group persons may act as a core group proxy to that group when it meets. If this is not done, then differences of opinion will inevitably arise, which can unhappily create ambiguity and even confusion. It must therefore be a fact that only one member of the core group acts as its representative at a time. Billy, this is to be understood. Consequently, we will in future be guided by this, which will undoubtedly happen, so that never again will two core group members together carry out direct meeting supervision, but only a single core group member delegated for this purpose by the core group General Assembly. So it should be.
Good, then that is clear. But now I also have something to bring up, and that is in relation to Guido's book. Because just as you said some time ago that the title for the book was unfortunate, various proofreaders also think that the title is completely misguided and should be replaced by a suitable one, because the content of the book has nothing to do with an end station infinity.
This is indeed the case, which is why I thought about it and also consulted Quetzal. And we came to the conclusion that a title such as Important Facts Around Truthfulness, Facts from a Clear Perspective, Indisputable Facts, or Facts of Reality and Truth would be appropriate. However, this should definitely be accompanied by a slightly longer subtitle in smaller type, such as Results, Calculations, Billy Edward Albert Meier, Data, Explanations, Experiences, Circumstances, Plejaren, Realities, Circumstances, Beamships, Facts, Universe, Circumstances, etc.
I think that's good in itself, but let's see what our people think about it, who should also have their say.
Our suggestions do not mean that we insist on it, of course, because another title may very well be chosen.
I also understood it that way. But what do you think about the opinion that I should contribute something to the book separately? I was asked about that, and I think that would not be good because it is basically a book by Guido, and that there is probably already enough material in it that relates to me, just in terms of contact reports and experiences, etc.
I agree with you because it is a work by Guido and not one by you, so you should not write further contributions for it. The ones that are listed by you in the book manuscript are very well enough. More would only be harmful. I had to edit a lot in the manuscript by the two of us and still keep Guido's style. Bernadette also constantly revises other incomprehensible or complicated things, as I can always see from the editing pages that Florina and Enjana call up from their computers so that I can also examine them. 18. Her work in this regard is also very important, even though it is obviously difficult for her to maintain Guido's writing style.
Which she does try really hard to do. But well, then that is also clear. Consequently, I can move on to another question. Last night, together with Ava, I watched a music program on TV, Melodies for Millions, in which good old music was brought from the last century up to 1985, which was really harmonious and psychically touching, and gave me an exceptionally good well feeling. In addition, I received a letter from an esteemed and dear friend who subsequently asked how I myself am towards music and how you play Yaren perform this. If it is possible for you to say something about this, then I would personally also be very interested in what explanations you can give in relation to the music.
Since this question is also your concern, I can go into it and thereto say the following. The music corresponds to a very wide-ranging might, and indeed both in the positive as well as in the negative. It characterizes the human being already from birth and touches him or her in the depths of his or her self-created inner nature, which he or she also shows to the outside world, and this has nothing to do with the innermost creational natural nature. The might of music acts therewith on the human being in accordance with the wise, as his or her inner nature is formed in the evil or good, that is to say, negatively or positively, such as rebellious, malicious, disharmonious, spiteful, mean, sneaky, infamous, chicken-hearted, envious, psychopathic, deadly, immodest, unfree, unfair, unhappy, unsatisfied, embittered, pernicious or angry, etc., or equalized, merciful, modest, free, friendly, peaceful, patient, pleasant, kind, good-natured, harmonious, helpful, calm, restrained, reliable, warm-hearted and courteous, etc. Thus, the music has, depending on its positive, that is to say, harmonious, or negative, that is to say, disharmonious form in itself, that it effectuates that which is good and positive or negative and bad in the human being. Therefore, in the negative case, the might of the music can drive the human being into a psychical misery, into a moral decline, and into a general malignant downfall, just as, however, lead him or her in a positive wise to the psychical elation and to high performance, etc. Good music creates high cultures, and through bad music, high cultures are destroyed again, and thus since time immemorial it happened and is happening also on the earth. In a good positive phase, with regard to the music, times always prevailed in each case, which were peaceful, good, and progressive. If, however, phases of negative bad music arose, then the times were bad. With bad music, irresponsible rulers and other elements often seized the political and military might and instigated fights, wars, and upheavals, like, for example, the world wars on the earth in the last century. Therefore, which were from 1914, 1918, and 1939, 1945, as well as the Vietnam and Korean Wars, and in the last 25 years, war actions which broke out in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the current criminal machinations of the Islamic State, as you correctly call this murderer and criminal organization. Since time immemorial, harmonious forms of music prevailed before and after such events, through which earth humans and peoples were attuned peacefully. Observed and considered with respect to the earth, the good and positive music which sprang up after the last wars changed again in recent times. That is to say, in the 1980s, into the negative and bad and even into the evil, as you yourself have said many times since then. So prevailing on the earth since the 1980s, the might of a very negative music from which the humankind, the politics and economy, the armies and religions are maliciously negatively influenced and controlled, through which very much mischief, hardship and misery as well as destruction is wrought, as this is also proven by the many hotbeds of war, uprisings, and criminal machinations in many corners of the world. Not only with us Plejaren, but also with the human beings of Earth, the might of the music has been known since ancient times, this with terrestrial peoples, particularly in the ancient high cultures. Who knew that the might of good, positive music helped civilizations to improve, while negative, bad music, in turn, sealed their downfall? Primarily, great philosophers knew about the might of the music and its influence on the societal decision, this both in relation to the upswing as well as the decline of civilizations. However, they also knew of the might of harmonious, good and positive music, through which promoted the intelligence and the psyche could be refined, or that through disharmonious, negative, bad music, much terribleness had been wrought, to which entire advanced civilizations fell victim. They had, however, also known that under certain circumstances, music gives rise to similar frequencies as hypnosis in the brain of the human being, and indeed both in the good and positive, as well as in the evil and negative. The human beings of the ancient high cultures were clearly aware that through good, harmonious, and positive music, the human ability to learn increased enormously, and also the character as well as the good and positive modes of behavior become refined. Music is for the human being one of the most important factors of life with regard to the formation of his or her thoughts, feelings, and the psyche, because it imparts to him or her a value consciousness, but unfortunately not only in that which is good and positive, but also in the evil, negative, and bad. If the value and the might of the harmonious music is highly estimated, then the human being also feels uplifted and feels impulsations of the equalizedness, the love, the peace, and freedom in themselves, whereby in the same wise also his or her morals and behavior are equally influenced. However, if the music is disharmonious, of inferior value to completely valueless, then the human becomes weighed down by aggressiveness and unequalizedness, and finds no access to real love, to true peace and open freedom, as well as not to a valueful moral state and to corresponding modes of behavior. And on the earth today, exactly these evil, negative and bad forms prevail among countless human beings of earth of all ages, because they are caught by the might of this malicious and disharmonious music, which since the 1980s prevailed as fashionable and in its spell transfixes all those human beings of earth, who in themselves are even malicious, aggressive, unequalized, unhappy, unorderly, abusive, negative, unsatisfied, often conscienceless, rebellious, and irrational ones. The human being of earth should themselves therefore follow the example of a child, because as long as they are not influenced in a bad wise by evil, disharmonious, negative, and bad music, they are open for good, harmonious, and positive music. Thus, if the child is observed and considered, then it is to be said regarding this, that they, at least as long as they come in contact with normal, good, harmonious, and positive music, are better able to perceive distinct, nuanced tones in the communication, and indeed fully independent of whether they can enjoy any good musical instruction or not. This indicates that through the music, they can learn to pursue their own thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and are able to sense the voice tones of other human beings as to whether something is right or not with them. However, the world of music and its tones enables not only the child, but also the adult human being to better understand his or her surroundings and to communicate themselves to the fellow human beings. Among us Plejaren, for millennia, it has no longer been a secret how much the music promotes, in many areas of the development of the human being, also cognitive, mental, emotional, and social capabilities. The musical intelligence corresponds to one of the most important parts of the intelligence of the human being. Music allows the connections between the nerve cells of both hemispheres of the brain to grow in a better wise, whereby also the concentration and communication is promoted. Therefore, it will also be well understood that it is particularly important that the human being should be musically active themselves, such as by he or she singing or playing a musical instrument. At the very least, it is necessary that while listening to music and singing, it is jointly lived in a thought-feeling psyche-based wise, because a purely passive listening to music brings only little or nothing at all, which could increase any values in the human being. Already in childhood and even already in infancy, the human being should be continuously confronted with good, harmonious, and more positive valueful music, because this improves the performance of the intelligence and especially the capabilities of the spatial imagination. Sprinkled with harmoniously good and positive music, not only the child, but also the adult human being is more receptive. Socially competent, self-confident, equalized, peaceful, free, and behavior-wise more humane than a human who is unmusical or kills his or her time with disharmonious music. Although no better humans can be created with good, more harmonious and positive music, nevertheless, already created talents and good characteristics certainly deepen, because fundamentally the education has an effect in all the things of the behavior, with which the human being is formed on the one hand and he or she forms themselves on the other hand. Music, however, can make the human being especially happy. This is an undisputable fact, because gladly heard, harmoniously good and positive music stimulates specific regions of the brain which are responsible for ensuring that positive and peaceful as well as free thoughts are nourished, from which pleasant feelings originate. Good, harmonious music is always an incentive, creating calming and good memories that are always connected with revitalizing thoughts and feelings, by which often many problems can be solved, also with regard to interpersonal relationships. On the other hand, exactly the opposite emerges with disharmonious, negative, ungood, and bad music. In the brain, distinct areas are addressed, and indeed both with disharmonious as well as with harmonious music, although the forms of behavior in human beings are accordingly different. With harmonious music arises decisiveness, excitation, joy, being inspired and upbuilding feelings of elation as well as interest. Whereas in fact, in the negative case with disharmonious, bad music, even oppressive, negative, unequalized thoughts and feelings as well as corresponding actions and behaviors arise. Really harmonious music is a pleasure, and in addition work for the thoughts, out of which proceed corresponding feelings. In the brain, the entire musical tones are once again newly put together, through which the brain is formed. And when it is frequently exposed to these challenges, then it changes itself, and namely in accordance with the wise, just as the tones of the music are formed, simply negatively or positively. The brain adjusts itself to the tones of the music negatively or positively, simply in accordance with the disharmoniousness or harmoniousness. The music effectuates in the cerebral cortex that the nerve cells there enlarge themselves and link themselves up better. In human beings, the musical ear is trained from a young age as a consequence of what is given to him or her to hear. Therefore, this also means that music, for example, sounds wonderful for one human being or cultural circle, whereas compared to another, it can come across rather repulsively or strange, which effectively has to do with the personal understanding of music. But that has nothing to do with disharmonious, negative, ungood, and bad music, as this has prevailed far and wide on the earth since the 1980s, and which equals more of a yowling, screeching, whining, and a misuse of the sounds and tones than real music and real singing. Such can sound only malicious, disharmonious, and bad for a musical ear, while for abysmally disharmonious human beings it promotes their aggression, aggressiveness, naivety, unequalizedness, unhappiness, and unsatisfaction as well as unreliability and so forth. However, music still has other effects, because it creates a great influence with respect to the management of time in the brain, the thoughts and feelings, as well as the psyche and the self-perception. Music as an affect on all levels of the brain. And it has direct access to the thoughts, feelings, the emotions, and to the psyche, and since time immemorial, it is anchored deeply in the history of the human being. Music makes use of ancient mechanisms of the human psyche and the human motivations, and human beings can even profit from it. If they hear sad music, especially then if they have grief or are in sorrow, as well as if nostalgia is presented, which often consists of a mixture of joy and sorrow. Music is an expression of creational natural laws that can also be explained as cosmic laws of nature, even though it is also a specific expression of the human thoughts, feelings, and inventions. From this, it also can be recognized that among the countless noises occurring in nature, many sounds and tones appear, which sound harmonious and fundamentally already embody a structure of music.
Thanks. Your explanations tell very much. Today, the human beings of Earth often carry the music around by schlepping around headphones in the ear and the MP3 players in the jacket pockets. The danger is particularly on the streets and traffic, because they no longer hear any outside sounds. Consequently, there are many fatal accidents because of that. In the past, the humans carried around portable radios and let these play at full volume, which created a lot of trouble. And as you have said, it's the howling and yowling as well as the instrumental noise and racket, which on the whole has become referred to as music since the 1980s and which makes the human being psychopathic and crazy, besides being equipped to wreak much calamity. And indeed, in addition to the fact that those human beings whose music sense is directed towards good, harmonious, and positive music are semi-driven into madness. From this I gather that according to your words, as a result of this catastrophic musical style prevailing since the 1980s, precisely that which is falsely called music, a very unpleasant future is to be expected. This also, therefore, simply because the human beings who indulge in this wailing and racket, which they call music, have no true sense of life, as well as no thoughts and feelings of a healthy self-worth, let alone because any sense to follow the creational natural laws and recommendations, through which to them the true love, freedom, harmony, and peace would be their own, and these high values would come to life and would be represented. As I see the matter, the whole thing is running once again towards another catastrophe and beyond. Thus again a new act of war may be pending, particularly because of the Ukraine, as well as a threatening financial debacle and a massive economic disaster, along with tremendous political turmoil and malicious and deadly Aussertungen. If the threats and senselessnesses of the EU dictatorship are looked at, considered and analyzed, in particular the threats and sanctions against Russia, and namely together with the United States, which of course has already fully grown into a serious international debacle, then comprehensive warlike machinations already threaten with the EU, the USA and Russia. And then only the EU dictatorship carries the blame for this, which itself wants to incorporate the Ukraine as a bulwark against Russia, which is still advocated and striven for by the inexperienced Ukrainians, because they do not recognize the dictatorship form of the EU.
That regarding music is in line with the meaning of what I said, and what you further allude to is absolutely within the realm of possibility and would again be, among other things, a downfall consequence through the power of the malignant, negative, bad, and unpleasant music that has once again dominated the world since the 1980s.
Since this roaring, howling, yelping, and howling as well as the instrumental noise and racket have arisen since the 1980s, which is called music, but which only corresponds to a wretchedness, the human beings of the earth have generally changed in all things very detrimentally, and even to the point of malignancy. If, on the other hand, I look at the general behavior etc. of the human beings before the 1980s, before the catastrophe radio howl music arose, then everything was still much more peaceful, free, and even loving and harmonious in certain relationships, and that in spite of the idiotic politics and the threats of the Cold War. Since the 1980s, everything worldwide has become very threatening, bad and degenerated into evil, as is also evident in the rising hatred of foreigners, races and religions, as well as in all the trouble spots and uprisings around the world, be it Afghanistan, the murderous criminal Islamist state, the civil war in Syria, the Israel-Palestine murder or the murderous organization Boko Haram, etc., etc., also the differences in the EU dictatorship as well as the coercive EU machinations with regard to Russia over eastern Ukraine are dangerous and divisive idiocies, from which an extremely aggressive and possibly even dangerous new division of Europe and an evil European conflagration can result. And all this is fueled by the power-hungry agitator Angela Merkel, who in the EU dictatorship and in the USA is waging an effective terror against Russia by chaining to herself, as her slaves, all those in bondage to her governments and the people and inciting them with her delusions of power, who blindly hang on the butt of this agitating ringleader in the matter of agitation against Russia. And should it come to pass, as has been the talk for some time, that modern weapons are supplied by Germany or the USA against the insurgents in eastern Ukraine, then all hell can really break loose and, as I have already said, plunge the whole of Europe into a conflagration. This is precisely because it is then to be feared that Russia will also get involved and equip the insurgents in eastern Ukraine with modern weapons, and even move in there with armed forces.
Also, your words and remarks of the form mentioned are in line with what actually is and what is threatening.
Whereby all the politicians in charge, female and male, are not intelligent enough to realize these facts, because on the one hand, they are hopelessly obsessed with their lust for power, and are therefore obtuse and blind to logic, while on the other hand their intelligence is not sufficient to grasp reality in its effectiveness and truth.
Which is indisputable and with the current events may actually bring much disaster over the whole of Europe, because all the wrong actions of the EU dictatorship powers against Russia, especially by this Angela Merkel, who is given a lot of attention in the EU dictatorship and in the USA as the EU ringleader, is disproportionate to the effective factual situation with regard to Russia's initial actions. The whole thing only became more and more aggressive and brought to its present state by the dictatorial machinations of the EU, because the EU dictatorship wants to incorporate Ukraine into its sphere of power, for which it is willing to use any means, as well as to inject billions of euros into Ukraine, which the Ukrainian powers crave and can be bought with. Under all the evil, murderous, bad, criminal, and destructive things that are currently prevailing in Ukraine and have been for some time, not only the peoples of the EU dictatorship are suffering, with many disadvantages, but also the Russian people, as well as the people of eastern Ukraine, where the insurgents murder, rage, and destroy, as does the Ukrainian army directed by Kiev, and also the mercenaries brought in by Kiev. This is in addition to a considerable number of pathologically stupid adventurers from the dictatorial EU states, as is also the case with the IS or Islamic State, in whose murderous, terrorist, and destructive machinations thousands of adventurers as well as Islamist fanatics and radicalized people from the EU dictatorship are involved. I do not understand why the media and those in power still speak of an Islamic State, although the IS terror militia has nothing to do with real Islam, which is why you also call this organization Islamist State, which corresponds to its inhuman machinations and is correct.
As for Islamist State, it is unlikely that the media and those in power will take up this term, even though it calls the matter correct, whereas Islamic State is really completely wrong for the IS murdering organization, and moreover insults and muddies Islam. Everything else you mentioned are also indisputable facts, but they are glossed over and concealed from the peoples by the EU powers, the USA, and also by other states, as has been the case in all such matters since time immemorial. But let us leave it at that, because there is nothing we can do about it, because this would be a matter of the peoples standing together and putting their government powers in their place. But that is probably a futile wish, because the peoples allow themselves to be deceived by their state powers through lies and false promises and crawl up their asses because they are in bondage to them and are too lazy and indifferent to think for themselves. So the peoples play themselves up as patient sheep to be misled, exploited, and ultimately eaten by evil wolves. This is unfortunately the case in many countries, the European Union being the best example, as well as various states around the world that, like the EU, know no form of democracy whatsoever, but only dictatorship and violence by the government powers that be, who arrogantly set themselves above their peoples and force them to accept what is prescribed and chewed for them. A system of government such as Switzerland has, where at least an acceptable partial democracy prevails and where those in power cannot simply dictate and drive over the heads of the population in a politically miserable way, as is the case in the EU, is unfortunately not to be found anywhere else in the world. Of course, some things in Switzerland should also be for the better and adapted to modern times and effective freedom, but despite these shortcomings, this country is the most liberal and democratic that exists in this world, and in which the people really have the say, except in extreme cases when so-called emergency decisions have to be taken. So there is actually nothing or very little to criticize about Switzerland, because on the whole everything works, even if in Switzerland there is also a tendency among many of the people not to think for themselves, but to let the government and the parties think for them.
I do not think I need to say anything more about that.
Is also not necessary. However, I would like to mention that in January I heard the blue tits chirping their spring chirps, to which I always say that they herald the arrival of spring. But the reason why they start their spring chirping is that blue tits start mating around mid-January. Consequently, their chirping song is actually a courtship and marriage chirp.
That is naturally correct. To which I must also say that I find the chirping of blue tits very harmonious and enjoy listening to it.
I think so too, although it also has the effect that even in January, when it is still cold and snowy, a spring mood somehow spreads through me, which makes the wintertime more bearable for me, about which I do not exactly break out in jubilation because of the cold, because warmth is very much preferable to me, which is why I also felt very comfortable in warm Arab countries, as well as in Persia, Pakistan, Africa, and India, and so on. But if it is all right with you, I would now like to discuss a few things with you in private.
Naturally, there is nothing to prevent that.
Good, then the following.